Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today I'm reviewing Libertalia Winds of Galecrest from Stonemaier Games. And Libertalia, or specifically the Winds of Galecrest edition, is the reprint, the re-implementation of Libertalia, a game that came out in 2012 from Halimari, and Stonemaier Games is bringing this one back to your table with a whole bunch of changes. I'm going to go through the general point of the game, how it plays, review, all of that stuff, and in all the timestamps I have down below, there will be a section covering the differences, if you're interested in just seeing whether this is worth picking up, if you already have the original, what changed, all of that stuff. But at its core, Libertalia is a game in which you're trying to get the most loot. That's the core idea. You're a bunch of pirates, you're trying to settle the treasure across 3 rounds of gameplay, escalating amount of things happening in each round. Round 1's going to have 4 days, round 2's going to have 5 days, and round 3 is going to have 6 days. And in every single round, you have a hand of cards, a hand of pirates, that you're going to be playing down onto the island in order to utilize their abilities to effectively gather as much loot as possible. That's the core concept of what's going on here. The actual implementation of the game is you have 40 different characters that you're going to be playing with. Every player has 40 characters, and you're going to have a certain player, just pick one random player, and they're going to shuffle up their deck, and they're going to grab 6 random cards from their deck. From there, other players will go ahead and match those 6 cards. So you can see over here, I have these cards that I shuffled up and randomized and grabbed over here, these cards, and then the other players go ahead and match those exact 6 cards, so we're all starting with the same hand of cards, because this is a game about doublethink. This is a game about knowing what your opponent has and trying to predict how to play around that. Because you have 4 days and 6 characters. You're going to have 2 characters left over for the next round, more or less depending on abilities, but that's the general framework. And you're going to pick a character, and every person is going to go ahead and put one character face down on the board. I'll have another character over here. They're going to go pick theirs. You pick there, and all players, this is going to be a 1 to 6 player game. There's a solo mode, there's a 2-player mode, but I would say without going with exceptions, you're looking at a 3 to 6 player game, and you're going to have all the players reveal their card and put them down into the island in order from the lowest to the highest. So you're going to place them down on the island. From there, you're going to, starting from the lowest and moving upwards, as you can see over here, you're going to activate all day abilities. So you're going to look at this character, there's no day ability. You look at the governor, discard all characters from your ship, gain 1 reputation for each character discarded this way. We haven't talked about the ship. We'll show you what the ship is in a second. Then when you're done resolving all the day abilities, you're going to go ahead and resolve these abilities, the dusk abilities, in reverse order, and then picking a loot at the same time. So effectively, day abilities happen in order from smallest to largest, and dusk and collecting loot, larger is better. So you're going to resolve any dusk abilities, which we don't have in here, so we can ignore that. But the governor is going to pick one of the loot tokens from day 1, and then the top man will pick the next loot token. You're going to resolve that for all the players in the game, and you will have, usually, you have enough loot for each player in the game. So a 5-player game will have 5 pieces of loot in each box. A 2-player game is an exception, where you'll have 3 pieces of loot, but in general, it's 1 piece of loot per player. And you're trying to get the best piece of loot, the piece that helps you the most in the game. And then, of course, resolving all abilities. From there, you'll pull all characters down into your ship. Any character that's over here will go to your ship, unless an ability changes that, and that will be your basic ship, which will last for the rest of the round, and you'll activate all night abilities of characters in your ship. Finally, at the end of 4 days in round 1, 5 days in round 2, and 6 days in round 1, and round 3, you're going to resolve all the end of round abilities, which are usually the anchors. The anchors are going to have certain end-of-round abilities that affect different things. You get a point for every character in your ship. You lose a point for every character in your ship. Different things like that will adjust for what happened and giving you an end-of-round ability, although there are ways to get rid of your own and or other players' characters from the ships before the round ends. That's the sequence of play. You play a card. You know the other characters that the other players have because you started with the same 6 cards, and you're trying to react and predict what to do based on, well, knowing those cards. When you move into round 2, you will draw 6 more cards. Again, that core player will draw 6 more cards. Every other player will draw 6 more to match, although this time there might be variability. This time you might have a character who has different characters left over from round 1. You might have kept 2 different characters. You might have utilized abilities in ways that help you draw characters back or do things like that, giving you a continuously progressing, slightly asymmetric hand, although always with the general knowledge of what's in play, always with the general knowledge of what's going on. Past that, in terms of resolving ties, whenever you resolve a tie, you're going to look at the reputation track and resolve the tie based on the reputation track. The higher you are in the reputation track, the more you'll break ties compared to other players. The lower you are in the reputation track, the more money you'll get at the beginning of the round, because you could start off with money every single round. At the end of a round, you're going to put all your loot, all your coins, into your treasure chest, storing it and safe locking it from other players so it can't be hit. Rinse and repeat for 3 rounds, and that's basically the game. Past that, the game comes down to the fact that you have 40 unique characters, all with their own abilities. You have 7 unique loot tokens, and there are different ways you can play with the loot tokens. The game does have 2 sides to the board, one with a little harsher, one with a little more computational, one with a little more easygoing. And then it also has these, which you can just randomly put out in whatever orientation you want to create the specific type of game with the specific abilities of those tokens that you want. And that's effectively Libertalia. As far as ease of play on this one, this is a really easy game to teach. It's like a 3 or 4 page rulebook, very easy to dive into, very easy to learn. As far as teaching it as well, same basic idea. It's a very easy game to dive into. There's not a lot going on. Most of the game comes down to the thinking through what other players are going to do and how to react to that. The core concepts, the core rules are fairly simple. Table space is what you see here. Every player is going to have their own ship, which just basically means they have their cards that they're playing down into the ship that will clear at the end of each round, as well as the loot tokens. And game time comes in, generally it does depend on player count, but it's simultaneous play, which means the player count only adds a little bit to the game time. But I would say at smaller player counts, it's going to come in 30 to 45 minutes. At larger player counts, 45 minutes to an hour. As far as player count, speaking of which, this is a 1 to 6 player game. There's a solo mode from the Automa Factory, and then there's a 2-player slight adjustment or variation to the rules, but generally for the most part, 3 to 6 is likely going to be the most common player counts as far as what the game state is trying to achieve. And speaking, I guess, perhaps biasedly, I've played this game at 3 to 6 players. I played at 3, 4, 5, and 6 players. I've played the original version of the game as well. I'll be comparing my general thoughts of those differences when we get down to that section. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, the biggest thing that I like about Libertalia, the thing that makes it stand out, is that mental mind game. It is that aspect of having a hand of 6 cards from this deck of 40 cards, and then looking at your abilities and understanding that every player has the same biases in play. This is not a game where you built your own deck, where you're deck building, or some way, shape, or form, you're just trying to do the best with what you have. This is a game about knowing what you have, knowing what other players have, and understanding that you're all thinking through the same thoughts, and then trying to outthink your opponents. Well, obviously, this character is the best character to play in the first round, so that means you're probably going to play that, but that means that's not going to help. So if you're playing that, I can play this. But meanwhile, they know the same thing, and so you enter this little game of doublethink, the mental mind game of trying to predict what makes sense for you, what makes sense for them, and how it makes sense for you to react to them, knowing they're trying to react to you. Multiply that by the number of players in the game, and it goes from intensely strategic at lower player counts to a little bit more drifting party and chaos at higher player counts, just because practically speaking, I can try to, think through how 2 or 3 players are acting. When you get to 4, 5, 6 players in the game, it gets a little harder to actually be right across the board. So it drifts from strategy and outthinking each other to higher chaos and party mode and higher player counts. But to me, the core aspect of Libertalia that makes it stand out is that mental mind game. It is that doublethink. It is that thought process of dealing with the loot in the board, the characters in your hand, and trying to figure out, well, now what makes the most sense. And the starting hand being the same. This starts off with incredibly just exactly identical. So that first round of the game, you have 6 cards. They're exactly identical. There's not that many choices. You can easily rule out 1 or 2 cards that just don't make sense for that first play. And that means you're looking at 2 or 3 cards for your very first play, and that will slowly get both more and less as the game progresses, because other players are slowly playing their cards out, which changes the symmetry of your hands, but also you now have fewer cards left, which means it's easier to predict what other players are going to do. That's round 1. Round 2 is going to shift up, though, because in round 2, it's more and more likely that your hands start to differ from one another, and you start having a harder time tracking what other players still have going on. Did they pull a card back from their discard? Did they go ahead and pull back a card from their ship? Did they go ahead and play a card from their hand directly into the ship? There's going to be a variety of abilities at play that change the state of the player's hand, so it starts off very symmetric as you go through how to outthink each other, and it develops to a bit more chaotic as you go through those 3 rounds, giving you different aspects of things to consider and ways to approach the game the more you go through it. And there's tons of card abilities. There are 40 card abilities in the game. The loot's going to completely change the puzzle every single time, because the way the loot interacts with their characters changes that mental mind game of, if you don't want that loot, then you don't want to do this. If you're worried about losing a character, you'll do that. And so you have these variations of the loot, the variations of the character, giving you a ton of different mindfulness, a ton of different situations to play through as you go through the game. And the playtime and complexity versus the length of the game is absolutely incredible. This is an easy game to play. This is an easy game to learn. It's an easy game to table in terms of being even under an hour, even at 5 or 6 players. And it gives you a decent amount of strategy in the game for that investment, for that time investment, for that learning investment, for that general ease of play investment. This game gives you a lot of game. And it accommodates a wide range of players. Like I said already, you're going to have different play styles at lower player counts versus higher player counts, but it does work well at those player counts. This is a game you can pull out with 6 people. It will, again, shift a bit more into the chaos aspect and a little bit more partyish because you can't control for as much, but it will still be a good, engaging time with a lot of laughter as things resolve differently as you go through it. And then the lower you get in the player counts, it drifts more towards cutthroat strategy, trying to outthink and outpace. Still with those moments of fun where you're like, I can't believe you got in the way that way. You played this card, you did that, and this sequence of events resolves differently depending on what people play. But at all player counts, there's strategy, there are decisions, there's chaos, there's fun, just a different experience depending on lower versus higher player counts. As far as things I don't like, some card combinations in Libertalia have wound up with less fun games for me. This is a game where I generally like the experience I'm getting to the table, but there certainly have been games, multiple games of Libertalia, both the old and the new, where I've gotten to the table and the combinations of abilities I have just aren't as interesting. Across 40 characters, it's all about the interplay with different abilities and how they interact, but you can have times where you have a character here and a character there, and you have your starting hand of 6 cards, and nothing is particularly interesting. 3 of those cards are immediately ruled out as not being good first round or first play picks. The other 3 are okay at best. And so I have had games of Libertalia that were a little anticlimactic just because of the randomness of the way things came out, the way they interacted with the loot tokens at play. And so Libertalia, while mostly giving you a pretty solid experience with a lot of strategy and development to it, I have had games sometimes that were a little bit less ideal than what I would ideally like. Secondly, is I wish the game, especially this is specifically regarding Libertalia Winds of Galecrest, I wish it had taken the not necessarily time, but the approach of being a drop more confrontational when they lean into the confrontational aspect. What I mean by that is Libertalia has always been a game of a little bit of take that. And so many games, in their production, Winds of Galecrest, one of the things they've done is they've given you different sides of the board, a friendlier side and a more aggressive side. But especially when you factor in that you could have these abilities and completely make the board what you want, the aggressive side feels similar in the level of aggression to the original Libertalia, while the other side, while the friendly side, feels like it eased it back a bit. I wish they had taken the time, or perhaps a set of new tiles, and that's something that could still be an expansion in the future, obviously, but I wish there had been even more aggression, even more confrontation as an option in the game. Libertalia has always been fine where it was at for me, at least in terms of the level of interplay, the level of take that I like. And while I appreciate the fact that there is more of a friendly option for those who want it, for me, I want to dive a bit more into the aggressive stance. I want to dive into all of these tokens being a little bit more in your face in terms of what they do. And so again, it could be an expansion in the future, but I just wish we had that option in this game to even further lean down into the head-to-head aspect of the game. As far as what I can see others not liking, going directly counter to what I just said, this is a game of screwage. Even in the friendly mode of the game, even when you ease it back into the friendlier tokens and the less interplay, the character cards are still going to interact with you in a way that involves things like discarding other characters, using cutlasses to hurt each other, although again that changes which side you're going with. But there's going to be a degree of take that, a degree of outthinking your opponent, a degree of people playing cards and just having things not work out well for them. You could have a sequence of play where you play 4 or 5 cards and then every single time you're outplayed by an opponent, so you could have a bad experience playing Libertalia if you are being outplayed by the other characters. The whole game comes down to that doublethink. The whole game comes down to trying to outplay others, which means someone who's not well versed in the game or just the general genre of gameplay might be going far too often for the obvious moves, or just moves that even if they weren't obvious, they're just being outplayed by the other player, and you can go through an entire round of play having every single one of your moves be the least efficient move at the table, which just will result in a negative experience playing the game. As far as changes from the original, before we go into final thoughts, changes from the original and how I feel about them, because there are a bunch. To begin with, there's the art, and this already I've seen as being very divisive. The original Libertalia had absolutely amazing art, leaning heavily into the nitty-gritty theme of the game. And the Stonemaier Games version of it does feel more like a Stonemaier Games production in the general presentation of the art style, and it does seem to be leaning a little bit more heavily into that family-friendly aspect. I happen to like the new art. I love the original art. I like the new art. They're different styles, totally different styles in terms of what they're delivering, so that's going to come down to personal preference, but I'm totally fine with the new art as is, they both being something different to your table. Secondly, from there, you're going to have the change of the 4, 5, and 6 rounds across. I mean, you have 3 rounds to the game in your 4, 5, and 6 days in this version. The original Libertalia just had 6 days every single time. That's another change that I like, but specifically because it changes the equations of which cards are better for which rounds. When I play Winds of Galecrest, there are times where I hold on to a character for the second or or third round because I want to get that additional day or whatever it is out of them. So it changes the calculus, adding more to the strategic choices, while also even slightly, not a lot, but slightly reducing the length of the game. So overall, that's a change that I like. I like what it adds to the game. It's not a big change, but I do like what it adds to the game. Along with that, they also have the fact that the original Libertalia gave you 9 cards in each round for 6 rounds, so you always had 9 cards as your starting hand to choose from. That one's a bit of a pro and a con for me, because the new one basically gives you 6 cards for 4 days, as opposed to 9 cards for 6 days, meaning you're choosing less from those initial characters. I can see that one going different ways for different players. For me, it is mostly a positive change with a caveat. The mostly positive aspect is the fact that I like the fact that when I'm looking at a hand of 6 cards, that first starting round, there's a lot more opportunity to actually think through what other players are going to do, because that lower range, which will expand as the game goes on, there's less opportunity of trying to predict from 9 cards, you're trying to predict from 6, which gives you a little bit more control over trying to think what other players are doing. The potential downside is sometimes you're a little bit more a victim to having bad hands because you have fewer cards. And so it's a bit of a pro and a con. I think overall I lean towards pro, with the slight con aspect that it can lead to having slightly more often a less ideal game experience. From there, we also have loot token abilities. The loot tokens are going to be double-sided, which is just a pure quality of life. The production value of this one in general, I think, is much better. As far as the loot tokens themselves and their abilities, we have variety in their abilities. There's now 2 abilities per loot token, which is just, I mean, that's just a good thing to me, because even if you like the original tokens, the original abilities and whatnot, you have both options on the table as far as slightly more friendly, slightly more aggressive, but you have the variety there, so that's just all around a positive to me. The reputation track is one of the bigger positives I have, in the sense that in the original Libertalia, each card had a little numbering system on the side, which would indicate if both of you played the 21, whoever has the higher number, it goes first in that progression. And I never loved that, because it felt a little random and you never really knew which person had which number, so it often didn't feel like there was as much control over the game state there. I vastly prefer the change to the reputation track. The reputation track is a new concept in this version of the game, where you can modulate and adjust the reputation track to see whether you're going first or getting more money, and that changes the calculus of actually feeling more in control of your game as you play it. So that's one of the biggest positives that I like, although the second biggest positives I like is the fact that there's 10 extra characters. Original Libertalia had 30 characters, this one has 40 characters, which just means even further variety to your game, more opportunities to have different combinations of cards, which is going to be even further magnified in the variety of your experience, because you're getting fewer cards per game. Instead of 999, you're getting 666, so it's a total different calculation as far as how many characters you're going to see and how repetitive the game is going to be. So for the most part, I like all the changes across the board. The ones that are a little bit more mixed are the art, where I like both versions, and that aspect of having drawing 6 cards instead of 9, which gives you more control, but at the cost of potentially a less ideal experience, although obviously you can house rule that either way. But that's as far as that, which brings us to final thoughts on this game. Libertalia is a game that I really liked, and also I got rid of it. Not this one. The original Libertalia is a game that I liked, I had in my collection for years, and eventually I got rid of it because it did have those occasional not ideal plays. It occasionally had games where I just brought it to the table, and I just had not as fun of a hand. Now, some of that is going to come to the mechanical aspect. I really never loved that reputation aspect. I never loved the idea that I would correctly play a card, but I didn't know what your number card was in the hand, so if you played the same card, it just came down to, okay, great, I mean, maybe I win, maybe I don't know. And that took a lot of fun out of the experience. That combined with the fact that you occasionally had dead plays of the game, not dead plays, but less ideal plays, made it one that I really liked. I kept it for years, and eventually I moved on from it. Libertalia Winds of Galecrest, for me, seems to be almost all directions a positive shift to the experience, in almost all directions. And for right now, I'm very solidly enjoying this one. Granted, this is very new, and we'll see how it fares over time. But the game is clean. The ability to play it is easy. It plays well at a variety of player counts. It very often gives you an ideal play experience. The double think in the game, when you don't get a dead hand of cards, I appreciate the lower amount of cards you're getting, because it's easier to predict what other players are playing and react around that, although again, they're doing the same exact thing back to you. Overall, it's the mental mind game that keeps me coming back to Libertalia. That, combined with the lower player count, makes it a solid experience. For me, when you have a game of Libertalia, and this is one of those ratings where I'm going to have a bit of a asterisk to it, overall, to me, Libertalia is a 4 to 5. I really enjoy the game, and it gives you a lot of game in a very accessible, easy experience with a lot of doublethink and a lot of fun moments. The caveat there is when you have those bad hands, it drifts down easily to a 3.5 out of 5, and in terms of how often that happens, that's going to be the question. For me, Winds of Galecrest has mostly been a win so far across my plays of it, although time will tell. Ultimately, it may come down to a thing where I just play it enough times games, and eventually I get a few more bad plays in it, and maybe this one won't stay in my collection either. But for right now, it's sticking around because it gives me a solid, accessible experience, plays well at a variety of player counts, has a lot of doublethink and screwage, and is just overall a blast to play. As far as other game recommendations, there's two really that are going to lean heavily into that same aspect of doublethink and thinking through what players are doing and trying to react around it, which in general is a mechanic that I like in games, that aspect of just trying to get in someone's head with a limited set of cards and trying to predict around them. And those two games are going to be Brave Rats, which is a two-player head-to-head experience where you have the identical hand of cards, and it comes down to the order you play the cards in order to try to win the experience. Again, thinking through, you're going to play this, I'm going to play that, how's that going to work out? And then similarly, Citadels. Citadels is a fantastic role selection game where you're always trying to think, what would they have done, how did they react, and how can I correctly call and predict around what I think that they did and whether I was right or wrong. But it plays at a much larger player count as far as Citadels. Citadels is going to be more comparable to Libertalia in terms of the spots they both fill in my collection. In any case, until next time, I hope you found this helpful and useful. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and I hope you have a good one.